I read Interview with the Vampire for the very first time. I have this mega volume that has 3 books in one physical copy. It has Interview with the Vampire, it has Vampire Lestat, it has Queen of the Damned. I'm going through all of it for the first time now. Let's go through every single thought I have and have had over the past few days of reading Interview with the Vampire, because I've never watched the AMC show. I've been meaning to for years, but I have a sick and twisted, evil little parasite that lives in my brain that tells me I need to read the book first. And yeah, literally everyone and their mother has been like, don't read the book first. Don't read the book at all. Just watch the show, which is rare for a fandom. That's really hard to accomplish, but I can't help it. I am what I am. I documented via very detailed notes all of my thoughts throughout the entire reading process. Louis white. Not only that, but he owns an indigo plantation in Louisiana. Anne Rice uses how Louis views Black people to communicate the passage of time for the reader. The thing about it is that time means absolutely nothing to current day Louis, current immortal Louis. It's fluid. He's not really keeping track of it. There's no reason to keep track of it. So it's difficult for us as readers to really know when things are happening in the general world timeline. We just know that it's happening across a century or two. But at the beginning of Louis' story, he begins as referring to the only Black people in his life as slaves. And then you get brief mentions of runaway slaves. And then at some point you get a mention of like newly free men of color. Then they're just referred to as men of color. And then he just sort of stops paying attention altogether. And this has to be the most consistent and significant, despite being like barely mentioned, marker of the passage of time. He cannot help but bring up how stupid and annoying and terrible Lestat is just randomly throughout his story. There are many times when he's telling his story when he's like, yeah, and then Lestat did this because he lacks common sense. And then Lestat did this because he's stupid and awful and the worst. Like, yeah, that is also how I recount stories and memories with people I despise. There's this quote that Louis says on page 13 that I think is very telling of his entire character for the entirety of this story. People who cease to believe in God or goodness altogether still believe in the devil. I don't know why. No, I do indeed know why. Evil is always possible and goodness is eternally difficult. And yeah, doing good is eternally difficult for Louis. And we watch him struggle through his faith through all of his years of vampirism, maybe even a little bit before, seeing himself as a damned hellish creature, even though he is at odds with his trust and faith in God. But for as much as Louis despises Lestat during this entire storytelling process, he has these really, really distinct and interesting moments where he overlaps and shows just how similar they are, whether or not because they've always been destined to be that similar or because of Lestat's influence over him. I think a little bit of both. Early in the story, Louis describes the act of being a vampire and the nature of being a vampire as being very detached emotionally. But then he talks about this great love with this woman, Babette. And the interviewer is like, hey, when you say you have these deep feelings of what? And Louis like, oh, you don't think I can feel love? You don't think I experience love? And the interviewer's like, well, you said you don't feel anything. So, and Louis has this really interesting response where he's like, do you view angels as being detached? Aren't angels detached? But aren't angels capable of love? He has this really significant moment where he compares himself and other vampires to angels of the Lord, angels of God, to defend his capacity and ability to love another human being, to love another creature in general. And I do believe that vampires are capable of love. I think we see this explored best between Louis and Claudia later. But the thing about this angel comparison is that we see another really significant comparison to angels and vampires later when it comes to the topic of Claudia, when it builds up to the topic of Claudia, and it's from Lestat, where Lestat is having his one of many confrontations with Louis about the true nature of vampires and insisting that Louis let go of his humanity and let go of all of his feelings and sense of remorse. And Lestat says, God kills and so shall we. Indiscriminately he takes the richest and the poorest and so shall we. For no creatures under God are as we are, none so like him as ourselves. Dark angels not confined to the stinking limitations of hell, but wandering his earth and all its kingdoms. I want a child tonight. I am like a mother. I want a child. Lestat makes a comparison between vampires and himself to angels of God, but in the sense of defending their right to murder anyone as they please, defending his right to be callous and cold and sort of unfeeling, which I think is one of the most interesting elements of their relationship dynamic is how they overlap in this angel comparison, but contrast on complete opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of why they feel the need to bring up this comparison, but still consistently placing themselves as above humans. There's actually a lot to do with conflicted feelings throughout this, and this is something that Louis also specifies at the very beginning. He says something that's like, being a vampire is about having two thoughts at the same time. The way it's worded is funny, but I think what it means is that to be a vampire means to be like constantly existing as a contradiction, right? Being a living dead person, living forever but living off of death, being detached emotionally while also feeling very deeply. And we also see this conflict within Louis in that he hates being a vampire, he hates all the destruction that comes with being a vampire, but also he considers being a vampire to be one of the greatest things that's ever happened to him. We see this in the creation of Claudia. He hates that he fed off of this little 5-year-old orphaned child, but also the act of feeding brought him so much pleasure. He hates that Lestat baby trapped him, but also he adores Claudia so much. And I really wish there could have been some section, even just like a single chapter, that was from Claudia's perspective, because Claudia is my favorite. She's just the most fascinating and interesting character in the entire lineup. She's an immortal 5-year-old. It's already horrible as is, but we see her suffer in not being able to age properly, age at all. She has the mind and the intellect and the viciousness of this decades to centuries old woman. But I'm fascinated with like Claudia being so gentle and also domineering over Louis, and Louis just like consistently having zero spine. I have a love-hate relationship with Louis because he lacks a spine. Claudia pushes back the most against Lestat. She's seemingly very fearless when it comes to confronting Lestat. She's the one who comes up with this plan to kill Lestat. She forces Louis to get it together. I am eager to get further along into the vampire Lestat because I do desperately need to know what was going on in Lestat's head whenever Claudia was a topic in any capacity. I need to see that relationship from his point of view. And we always knew that we were going to get his point of view because the way Louis and Claudia handled the killing of Lestat, I was immediately, God, whenever Claudia brought up, she was like, should we have burned the body? I got so angry at Louis because then he's like, he looked pretty dead to me. You idiot. I feel like if you actually wanted someone dead, you would make absolutely sure that they were like the most dead a person can be. Overkill is necessary in this scenario, but whatever. They were really bad at killing him. What I will say about these little adventures that Louis and Claudia go on before hitting Paris, them traveling through Eastern Europe, this being like their first adventure of freedom post Lestat, and like immediately being met with like weirdo vampires that are wrong and bad, and then also meeting humans that are painfully aware of vampires and them having to like act like they don't know what's going on, act like these humans are crazy for believing in vampires. They sat in that like inn or whatever and they were like, what? And then they just like very casually become like local legends by killing these vampires and like disappearing off into the sunset, or I guess into the night. That's so weird. Like imagine being those people in town. What the heck? This pale, how is he described? His skin is described as being like bleached bone. This unsettlingly pale man who matches the description of a vampire rolls into town with a 5-year-old and he's like, well, let's get to hunting, boys. Never to be seen again. This is ridiculous. But also, I think there's something really important about this whole interaction with those vampires that really highlights the drastic differences in curiosity between Louis and Claudia, because they meet these vampires and Louis like, damn, I guess this is what every other vampire's like, and me and Claudia are the only intelligent ones left. We're the only people like us left, I guess. And Claudia's over here like studying scientific method to understand like what made those vampires like that. Oh my God, Louis, get it together. She's got his back regardless. But Claudia being my favorite made me doomed from the beginning, because then we get into the last section of the book and we get to Paris and we see Claudia fall in love with Paris, and we see her be so drawn to taking on a new identity and breaking away and being more forward about breaking away from this child identity that she cannot shake and she wants to pursue and chase womanhood. She finds a doll maker that will make adult woman dolls. She's never had that before. She wants to chase adult femininity in any way that she feels like she can. And she's a type of bold that we have not seen before. And they finally run into other vampires that are like them, unfortunately. Anne Rice would make the ultimate vampire villains be theater kids. And Claudia is like the only one who is really, really on top of how shady these other vampires are, these theater vampires. But then also like these vampires are being so weird around Claudia because like, yeah, it's also pretty crazy to have a 5-year-old little vampire baby. And Claudia clocks that something's wrong long before Louis. Now I'm gonna give Louis a little bit of a pass because of Armand. Armand has mind control powers, so whatever. But it also hurts because like she was so close to leaving. She was just like 1 to 2 days out from escaping. And then Louis just sort of in and out of Armand's spell for like, I don't even know how much time, but it just very quiet and sad and slow and miserable. And then we're back up to current day when he's talking to his interviewer. And Louis, I was surprised and like genuinely agitated alongside Louis when the interviewer has heard this entire tale of woe and slavery and torture and toxicity and violence and death and destruction and misery. And we've gotten to the end of it and he's like, me next? Like, yeah, I'm also looking at him alongside Louis like, what is your like genuinely what is wrong with you? And then book 1 ends with like the interviewer seeking out Lestat. And ultimately, I'm left with this eternal, this never-ending sense of grief. Because that's really what this is for Louis' entire life. When he's not grieving his brother, he's grieving his humanity. And when he's not grieving his humanity, he's grieving his freedom. When he's not grieving his freedom, he's grieving Claudia. To be a vampire and to experience a story from Louis' perspective is to exist in this constant state of loss, of insurmountable, immeasurable, painful loss that breaks you down as a person. There's this constant questioning of faith, whether or not it's out of desperation or out of this grand sense of ego. But another reason why I'm very curious to explore further what goes on from Lestat's perspective in The Vampire Lestat is that he is, I think, a really good example of like when like toxic men like talk down to women and say that women are too emotional and you have to remind them that anger is an emotion. That's what I feel. That's what I think of when it comes to Lestat, who is insisting that vampires are this unfeeling race of beings. But he is enraged and he is jealous immensely. And I think that says something. He just feels the worst thing at all times. But I don't believe that he's unfeeling. And I'm excited to finally get into watching the AMC show because I have truly heard nothing but great things for the past, how long has it been? 3-4 years. I've seen some really great clips, some really great performances, and already know about some of the key changes, but this was solid. And we'll see what happens when I eventually finish Queen of the Damned and if I'm interested in continuing with the rest of the series, because I think it's like 13 books in total in the Vampire Chronicles. And those are all of my thoughts about Interview with the Vampire, the novel. Okay, bye.